In this episode of the Guru Viking podcast, I talk with Bar-ché Dorje, a Dutch Lama from the gTer tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. We discuss Bar-ché Dorje's early interest in Kebatinan, a Javanese esoteric tradition that saw him plunge his hands into boiling oil and deflect strikes from poisonous machetes. We find out how Bar-ché Dorje first made contact with Ngakchang Rinpoche, who was to become his tantric guru of over 25 years. We hear stories of the infamous wrathful teaching style of the wandering Ngakpa Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, with whom Bar-ché Dorje spent a great deal of time in Nepal. To minimize potential confusion, particularly for those who are unfamiliar with Tibetan-sounding names, I think it's worth pointing out some of the cast of characters in this interview. First of all, Bar-ché Dorje's main teacher goes by several names, two of which are used in this interview: Ngakchang Rinpoche and Ngakpa Kunzang. I interviewed Ngakpa Kunzang using that name twice on this podcast, in episodes 8 and 16. So when you hear either of those names, Ngakchang Rinpoche and Ngakpa Kunzang, we are referring to the same person. Ngakpa Kunzang's wife and teaching partner's name is Kandro Dechen, and she is also interviewed in episode 16. Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche is the main teacher of Ngakpa Kunzang, and his Sangyam, or spiritual consort, is called Jomo Sampel Dechen. There are other names used too, but only in passing. Those are the main figures featured. So without further ado, Bar-ché Dorje. Bar-ché Dorje, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure, for sure.
So I'm curious, the first thing I usually ask is, how did you become interested in Buddhism, meditation, and things of that nature?
Already from a young age, I was a little different, and I'm raised Catholic. And even when I was a young child, like 9-10 years, I went to 2 services and I really prayed. So I had like a really heartfelt belief. When I went older, I had some questions. I kind of liked Jesus and Maria, but I was not sure about the revenge mode of God, how he was depicted in that way. So I had some questions and started searching something else. Then I was also very interested in martial art. So I did I tried out some different martial arts. I did some boxing, Thai boxing. And then I found this martial art called Pencak Silat, which is from Indonesia. And that looked very much like a Kung Fu movie. So I really liked the movements and things. And not long being involved in that school, I discovered there was a whole meditation practice and almost like magical kind of stuff they did. Like you would go in some kind of a half trance and ask that teachers called pendakas to come into you, to move you. And so I was very interested in that. And they would then also give you some kind of protection. And I felt I could communicate with them. Although I never heard them, it was my teacher that was hearing them. I always had that feeling I was somehow not alone. And so I really went into that. So I went many times to Indonesia and they did things to me like they were put my hands in boiling oil. I was actually really afraid, when I felt the wok boiling with oil. I didn't want to put my hands in it. But then one of the teachers just pushed my hands in it. And then it didn't burn. And then, for example, they said, well, put the oil on your arms. And then they started with machetes banging on my arms and it didn't go into my arms. So as a young lad, that was quite funky.
So this is Kebatinan.
Kebatinan, yes.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about what that is and why you ended up putting your hand into boiling oil and get attacked with machetes and so on?
Well, Ilmu Kebatinan is a meditative system that is based in animism, but then it's integrated in a Muslim belief. So they always pray to Allah first, saying, well, you're the most powerful, but now we're going to chat with the beings that we want to invoke. And what they did with with the oil and with the machete, it was kind of proving that this was real. So we were talking about a machete and a spear point in East Java, that it has a poison in it, and when you have a cut with it, you would kind of die from it. And at the same time, there was this wok just boiling with oil. I was not aware what was going on. And then he was explaining later about this oil that it has been 7 leaves of graves of dead teachers and would have some kind of a protection. And so he went with his hand in there, just in the boiling oil. And then my teacher from Holland, who was visiting with me, also did the same. And then they said, Bar-ché, you too. And I put my hand above it, and I felt the heat, and I said, not me. And then suddenly this teacher took my hand and put it into the oil. So I was it felt hot, but was not burning. And then I took it out, and I was what the, I'm not going to say the word in this, but I was thinking it. And then he said, yeah, just put it on your arms. So I was still amazed, processing it, and without asking, his teacher took that poisonous machete, took my hand, and started banging like this on my arm, and I felt the impact like you would feel a finger or a sharp piece of wood, but it didn't go into the skin at all. So then I became very interested in all that. And that's part of the Ilmu Kebatinan. I mean, if you Google Ilmu Kebatinan, you see those things that people are doing that, like they try to cut the tongue, or they put things through, which is more called the bus. So it's quite almost like a circus attraction in Indonesia, where they sometimes show those things. I was never allowed to show those things because they said, if you show this off, then you will not have that kind of protection. So it was more like a private thing that I had experienced, and somehow that gave me confidence in the art. I never did that again. That only happens once in Indonesia. But then what I did do is go into some kind of a half trance with a meditation system, and you go into a state, and then you call them in, and then you feel your hands tinkling. So you first ask, do you want to put my hands up? Then your hands go up. It might be suggestion, but felt really real. And then if you want to have certain forms from the 14th century of a certain teacher, you can ask, and then you were pulled in a certain way. Of course, you need to know the language of Panchik Silat already to understand what they are meaning. But so that's what I practiced for quite a while.
What was the means of entering the trance?
A meditation practice. So you breathe very deeply in, saying, and take all the power of earth and heaven inside of me. Then you hold your breath for a while where you say, you have it and it will protect you. And then you blow out, so you blow out all obstacles and impure thinking. And you do that a few times. Then your hands are just on your lap. And then you just asked this teacher, and then you said, could you raise my hands? And then you just sit there until you feel that something else does it. And in the beginning, it goes very slow. But then when you get used to that, they start moving you. Well, that's how it feels anyway.
Wow. And how old were you when you were doing this?
I started when I was maybe 22. So I did it for quite a while.
You could only go so far with that system of Kebatinan, isn't that right?
You know, when you're 22, that's all very funky. And you see other people doing that stuff, But then you also notice that whatever the ilmus, the magical arts are, it doesn't make you necessarily a better person. Actually, with some people, it actually made them worse, because they felt more special than someone else. And so it went to their head. It was a danger from that art. When you do hardings and you allow it to be in there, your arms feel like wood, and somebody else has the pain, and some people get a kick out of it, or you'll ask for this confidence in your radiation, and then there's we call it a spreuk. There's a saying of King David. They say, "My word is law." And then you can meditate on that, and that will be in your radiation. And so I was afraid I would go in a wrong direction, because I felt even the big masters, they still had, issues. And when I was young, I had quite a hot temper, and this was something also I wanted to deal with. And so then I started searching for other things. So I went to Amsterdam to some lectures of different teachers and read different kind of books. And then I started, especially the books of Ngakchang Rinpoche, I found extremely interesting. Also read some of Tartan Tulku. There were not so many available in Dutch translation in that time. But I really liked the Ngakchang Rinpoche book. And so I went back to the Nyingma Center in Amsterdam. And then I saw A Journey into Vastness, which was a book of Ngakchang Rinpoche. But he signs his books off as Ngakpa Chögyam. And because it says Chögyam, I thought it was one of Trungpa Rinpoche's books. So I started reading that, and then there was an address on the back, and I wrote a letter. And then I was invited to Wales to enter into a retreat.
What was it about that book that gripped you?
Well, what I liked most, I was trying out the meditation techniques, but what I liked most is, because I kind of felt in my previous practices, there was always like you need to believe, and somehow I started to create a resistance against that, like a blind belief system. And if you don't believe, it doesn't work. And somehow I was also not sure if this was just a suggestion, like a magical placebo or something, or if this was something that that was real. And somehow I was getting suspicion also. What was real, what was not real, what was me, what was that. And somehow it didn't matter, but somehow I wanted to find out. And in Journey into Vastness, it says you don't have to believe anything. There's a certain stage you can try to get for you, but you can't give someone else an experience. I mean, I can't give you the experience how a Finnish sausage tastes, but there's a method where you can then find out for yourself, and then if you have the experience, then you know. And in that time, that really appealed to me. And the way it was written somehow resonated in a way that I felt I wanted to travel to Wales.
So tell me about that first trip to Wales, meeting who would eventually become your teachers, Ngakchang Rinpoche and Kandra Dechen. Some listeners or viewers of the podcast will have seen my previous interview with Ngakpa Chögyam, as he was called in that particular interview, and also a video interview at their home. But for those that haven't seen those things and don't know about them, maybe you could say a bit about them. And then what was it like to meet them for the first time?
Well, I just I flew in, went to the airport, and I had no idea what to expect. It could be just some cult. I had no idea. Then one of Rinpoche's oldest students picked me up with the two children. I was kind of quiet because I was kind of looking what was going on. They were very friendly, and they drove me to a gentleman who's not around anymore. So I stayed with him, and from there we drove to the retreat place, what was in a country house in mid Wales. So I entered in there. There was a lot of laughter, a lot of fun. There was one gentleman sitting at the top of the table called Ralzik, and he had an extreme loud laughter, and I actually thought he was the teacher because somehow he was quite vocal. But later I found out it was Ngakchang Rinpoche. Kandra Dechen was not there at that moment. And no special feeling, just a group of people. I felt they were really close all together, laughed on funny things that I still had to find the humor of. My English was not so good either in that time. But then when the teaching started, somehow I felt, this is it, this is home. I really felt like, I'm going to invest my time in here. And of course, there's never a guarantee, but in the moment, that's how I felt. And so I had some questions, had a private chat, asked what it would take to become a student. I couldn't, because in that time there was a waiting list. because Rinpoche likes the man and female to be quite equal in that time. And so I went on a waiting list, and for a few years I went to their open retreats. So I kind of became part of the family anyway, because I went to all the open retreats. And in that time you had the city hopper to Cardiff from Amsterdam, so it was quite easy to fly up and down for quite a cheap price. Mm-hmm. So Ngakchang Rinpoche is, how can I describe him? Because I see him differently than other people would. For me, he's one of the big Tibetans of the world. Tibetan means treasure revealer. And then what I found a real advantage is he was from the same culture. Because after being in the Indonesian Kebatinan, I had no interest in entering to another culture. Although, of course, it comes from a culture, so certain things do come in. But I didn't want to become a Tibetan wannabe. And so what I found also extraordinary is that he had an answer on all the questions I had. Also about the Indonesian stuff, the Kebatinan, and he explained it in a way that somehow made sense. And so I just wanted to know more. I was still on me. I wanted stuff for me, and so I was very excited, and I really felt he could provide. And of course, later I really found out, especially spending time with Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, who spoke very highly of him. Somehow, he became quite a main teacher. Of course, he's not a Tibetan, so not everyone will see it in that way. But for me, he had more answers that made logic for me and resonated than a lot of Tibetan teachers that I saw in my history. So, and I actually understood a lot of Tibetan teachers because I had explanation from him. So I had a basis to actually communicate with other Tibetan teachers because of that. So for me, he's one of the biggest Tibetans alive at the moment.
And can you explain a bit what you mean by that? One of the biggest Tibetans alive.
That's hard to explain when you're not in that relationship. Things happen in your practice, in your life circumstances, and of course he becomes a trust person. He will consult you in a certain way, and when you apply certain methods of consult, things fall into place. He has a sense of where you are all the time and what you're doing, and then works with that in a very subtle way, but somehow it always works. For example, for me, it would never work if someone would say, you have to do this and this. Then I have those hair that goes. And so he really knew how to work with me. I was quite rough when I came to him, but he never cared. He somehow takes everyone in as they are. And he has what I could see, no judgment, whoever it was, or what the background is. Nowadays people make fun that when I started to talk, that in every sentence I said 3 times fuck. There you have it, the word. Because I was working in an Irish pub as a bouncer at that time, so I picked up how they spoke. But he never was insulted by it or said you should not use that. He had his own particular way of working with that. Like with that, he once said to me, he said, Bar-ché, do you know you would spend half of the time if you would leave that word out? So he had a way of dealing with that, and he does that with everyone on a very individual basis. And I was amazed how he could do that, how he could not be irritated by some personalities. And maybe he was, but I didn't see it. I couldn't, because I was really checking him out, because I met some other teachers that also had some dodgy things to express. And so I really wanted to check him out. Kunzang Dorje I never wanted to check out, because he was kind of always sweet, and that relationship came a little bit later because I think he was just dating her at that time. But him, I really wanted to check out. Like, is this guy for real or not? So, yeah, I asked all the awkward questions. Was not always polite. It was an interesting time. So I also kind of felt that, like, devotion, for example, a big thing in the Vajrayana, didn't work for me at the beginning at all. I was checking the guy out, and I would leave if he didn't check out. But then somehow it grows within that relationship. It's like when your best friend is a chef cook, and you don't like Japanese food, then no one's going to tell you need to eat Japanese food. But then if your friend has always had really good food, and you start having respect for the way he expresses his art of cooking, and he suddenly says to you, Bar-ché, there's this new restaurant. It is Japanese, but they have something, I'm sure you'll like it. Then you're going to be willing to try that out. And that's what I had with him. And somehow this is where the relationship started.
I want to ask you quite a bit about Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, actually. But you mentioned that he also spoke highly of Ngakchang Rinpoche. What sort of things did he say to you specifically?
Well, let's say we were on a pilgrimage. Ngakchang Rinpoche was there. And I didn't recall he did that when he was there, for example. But they gave him a stick, a walking stick of iron, because he requested one. And so the big group went, and I stayed a bit longer. And I've already been there a few times. I went there every year because he suggested it. And then some gentleman had a dream about him and asked him. And then he said, you should ask your own teachers and not me. Now you have created an obstacle, and now we'll have to beat it out of you. And then he took that iron stick. But then, of course, the gentleman came up to get the beating. And then I said, no, just fun. He says, I'm just an old yogi. And if I start beating you, then you go to the Nepalese police, and then Kunzang Rinpoche goes like this in the prison. Like, he was joking in that way. But then he became very serious. And then he said, this is actually a very important stick, because this can be given to one of the few lamas alive that has the same realization as I have. And we should all have a blessing of that stick. So then he blessed all those people that were there with that stick. And of course I knew that Ngakchang Rinpoche had given him that stick. So there was those kind of examples that were always there that he then expressed. Yeah, that would be one example.
You gave the example of teasing you or working with the way in which you were swearing a lot and cursing a lot.
Mm-hmm.
What is the point of the relationship, or what is the objective? If you stop swearing, you're moving towards something, or you're changing from one thing to another. What is the direction that relationship is carrying you in?
Well, somehow you lose a piece of image. Because, of course, I want to profile myself in a certain way. And somehow within that relationship and those group of people, holding on that image becomes less and less important. And somehow, so it slowly decreases. You have less need for self-protection or to profile yourself in a certain way. And, of course, the practice also helps you with that. Because one of the main practices is with working with emotional coping strategies that come up in circumstances and in your meditation practice, and to see what they really are and how they pattern you in a certain way, and therefore certain reactions come back all the time. And somehow you just scrape off those layers by the practice and being in that relationship with a group of people around the teacher. And that definitely did that for me. I was way more close-minded, had strong black and white opinions in life. I kind of grew up like that. And I think I'm more open-minded now than I've ever been. It's everybody can have the truth, everybody can have the sovereignty. I actually think it's extremely important that people find their own path, whatever that is. So there's much more allowance, actually. And actually, I find it interesting to meet all kinds of people in life that have different views. And I'm not insulted by someone else's view anymore. So that's what that has done. So I move quite easy through life. Can discuss many things no matter what the opinion of the other is. I think that would be one of the main things I achieved. I have a feeling of circumspection. So I have a feeling my way of communicating became much better. So because I have a sense how things going to be received. And I think that's also because of practice and being in that relationship where you're somehow with a group of people where you can mess up once in a while. And nobody's going to hold it against you. They're not going to put you in an irritable box. And then everyone else can also mess up. And everybody will sometimes, somewhere. Because if you work with scraping off layers of patterning and looking at your patterning in a naked manner, sometimes you will freak out in whatever way, and sometimes that expresses itself in a group of people where people are very different. People sometimes irritate each other, push each other buttons, and somehow there was always an allowance for that. You just apologize, and it was kind of not mentioned again, and then people didn't relate differently to you, and I feel I could allow that to extrapolate in my life circumstances. And so, connecting with people is actually quite easy for me at the moment. If a practice doesn't have an effect on your daily life, but it's just an esoteric hobby that's apart from your life, then what does it serve you? If it doesn't, change you in your life circumstances.
Yes, I think some of us like our hobbies to leave us unchanged. It's nice.
Sure.
Nice to have an esoteric hobby that's just that, because not everyone is interested in that sort of examination that you're talking about, despite its benefits.
Yes, that's correct. And maybe sometimes, there is this escape in culturalism or having a hobby. But somehow, I had an interest of being in a certain way and see how I could accomplish that. I mean, what does it mean that wisdom and compassion arises spontaneously from your inner being in all circumstances? If you want to know that, you need to have the circumstances. Because for me, it didn't make sense to be all peaceful for an hour on a meditation cushion, and then the neighbor says something about your car, and then you lashes out. It's the lashing out that I want to deal with.
And so you talked there about looking at patterns, and you've also just mentioned meditation. What are the main practices that you engage in then these days as a consequence of this relationship?
Well, meditation, called the Four Naljos and the Four Tingzins. There's a few books out there, so people can pick them up if they want to read them. Different mantra practices, connect with a transformation practice. Physical yogas. And then at the moment I hold also a Terma, so I'm exploring that, so I can start teaching from that platform more and more as a specialism into the gTer.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? Is that the Ling Gesar?
Yes.
Could you tell us a bit about that? I know you have a background in Pancak Silat and also Kumye, which is sort of Tibetan yoga style. What about this Ling Gesar?
Well, Ling Gesar is warriorship. It's how should I express it? Well, I'm just going to express it how I feel it is. It's like a handbook for Buddhas. And in that particular view, we're all Buddhas. You're as much Buddha as your neighbor, me, or the people that have recognized the Buddha. We're all Buddhas. And so when you have realized that state, you still need to communicate that with other beings. And the moment they are not recognizing they are in the state, there will be some resistance or a coping strategy coming out if you want to express a view in a certain way. So this is the martial art aspect. So it's not only a physical martial art, it's also connected with a verbal and energetic martial art, which is actually much more of this time, in offices and then dealing with people. We're not going to walk around with swords anymore to sort out things. It's much more energetically or verbally. And so you need to have a certain wisdom or sensitivity where people are coming from. You need to have a sense. Of course, in meditation, the more transparent you become for yourself, the more other people also become transparent. But if you have a certain knowing, a certain experience, and other people have not that experience, then from meeting with those beings, a certain demeanor and a certain way of communicating springs out of that. I mean, those are, for example, the 8 manifestations of Padmasambhava. He displayed different activities and different ways of being depending on the circumstances. And I think even Buddha Sakyamuni, called the Buddha, had the same thing. I mean, for the first 30 years, he couldn't allow women in his order. And the reason was, although he knew that women has exactly the same probabilities as men have, if you would do that in a Brahmin culture, where if a woman would even step on a holy ground, then the ground would be defiled for life, something like that, somehow then nobody would listen to him. So he needed to express his knowledge within the culture he was. And so this whole Ling Gesar, they call it a martial art because the moment there's an opposition of you, or people don't recognize what you want to express, then they will express from their pattern the way they believe the truth is, and then there's a way of dancing with that, there's a way of moving with that. And so it's almost the same like you just happen to have a ginger beard and somebody doesn't like it and throws a punch, then there's a way of moving with that. And that's physical, but this can be verbal, this can be energetically, this can be happen on all levels. It's a bit like you're the center of your universe and everyone else is in the peripheral, but everyone is their own center and then you're in their peripheral. And it's a bit like everyone influences everyone. So it's like when you look at the ocean, there's many different currents. And in that view, we are like a consciousness current that's influencing and being influenced. And that whole interplay is a play. This is where Rolpa comes from. Rolpa means enlightened play. And so all the practices and the whole system is based on that communication and become more and more skillful within that communication. The interesting thing of this particular terma, it means treasure, is you start practicing that from the beginning, even when you don't recognize your own natural state. So you'll take that on as a point of view, and then the whole phenomenal world becomes your retreat. So because whatever you perceive is patterned and moves through mind, and you move with it. And so all the practices is based on that. So I have an extreme interest in that because it's not about your own enlightenment or whatever. It's somehow moving with all that is and somehow having an influence on that in a most positive manner. And of course, when you're in the enlightened state or in your natural state, then even positive and negative becomes irrelevant. But when you're not in that state, you try to kind of influence positively. And so the less you are ruled by your own coping strategies and your knee-jerk responses, the better you're going to be at it. So again, the training ground is, of course, your sitting cushion and your meditation practice, where you allow the emotion to come up in a way that you can't justify it. Of course, in life circumstances, but somebody does something to you and an anger comes out of it, you justify your anger by looking at it's because of that situation, it's because of that person or whatever. The moment you justify it, you can't change it, because you have just justified it. But when you're sitting cushion, you somehow can't justify it. You have to look the emotion naked in the eye, and don't mean without clothes, but without feeding it. You don't feed the emotion, and then something will happen, and you create a space in the arising, and that will extrapolate into the life circumstances. So that's all part of the training. So there's a meditation emphasis in the Ling Gesar Terma, and then is being in the world where you try that out. So circumstances might push your buttons, and what I, for example, do is when the situation has pushed my buttons in whatever way, I just bring it in my cushion. So I just bring back what happened, I feel the emotions, and then I just drop the story and sit with the emotion. So I don't have to sit for an hour to allow it to come up. And then somehow some inner knowing comes from that. But it's a pattern that has been accumulated along our physical trail, or many lifetimes, if you want to believe that. And somehow it has to come at the surface, so you can liberate it. And then that will have an effect how you are in the world again. And the less you are ruled by those coping strategies, the more you can allow your inner wisdom to just come up spontaneously in all circumstances. So the wisdom and the active compassion somehow coming up as non-dual, because they can't exist without each other. And then there's a communicative aspect, which every Ling Gesar Terma has that. Because the principle of every Ling Gesar as a warrior king, this discord, and you enter in a situation to deal with that in whatever way is possible within your capacities. And of course, the more you react from your natural state, the more you can trust that spontaneity, because there's no self-perseverance. That's why we don't say there's a self-defense, because there's no one to defend. So that's in a nutshell how I would describe the overall Gesar Terma. Yeah.
Could you give an example of either yourself or someone you've seen, or a student of yours perhaps, in which one of these patterns has come up, perhaps been recognized through some means or another, and then related to differently?
Like, you mean in circumstances, or? Yeah,
an anecdote, for instance, to make what you said, which is very clear, to make it even more concrete, like an example of that type.
Well, when I was younger, I had quite a hot temper. Still have sometimes, but it expresses itself differently. And, when the hot anger came up, I woke up when the action was already done, as aggression. And that's why martial art was really good for me, because I had an outlet there. But that was the problem, because it went so fast that, there was a knee-jerk response. I went for it, the thing happened, and then much later, the awareness came in. Now it's much more, if it does come up, because it doesn't come up that often anymore, but if it does come up, somehow there's a space in the arising. So you feel it's going to come up, and it's going to come up, and then you can somehow drop the story or take distance from the story and actually liberate it on the spot. And if you can't liberate it on the spot, when the anger doesn't go away straight away, then somehow you have enough space to decide not to do a thing and then deal with the anger later. That can be in all kinds of situations. That can be like on the job, that can be whatever. It can be watching something on telly that you really don't agree with. It can be anything. Yeah, I have no desire of beating people up or something like that anymore. Or so it's not that kind of like it's not happening in the same way anymore.
So you've also spent a lot of time, as we mentioned earlier, with Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche. And in fact, Ngakchang Rinpoche's book, Ngakpa Chogyam's book, my listeners will know him as Ngakpa Chogyam, his book, Wisdom Eccentrics, is all about his relationship, teacher-student relationship with Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche. And it was reading that book that prompted me actually to reach out to Ngakpa Chogyam for an interview, because I think that book's really fantastic. And so the first interview I did with Ngakpa Chogyam talks a lot about Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, a very remarkable figure. And you spent quite a bit of time with him. Can you say a bit about who he was, what sort of a person he was, and also a bit about what your time with him was like? How did you come to meet him, and what happened in those times?
Well, I decided to go there for 3 months before my ordination. So I kind of, because I've not been in Nepal in that time, so I wanted to check it out. And so I told Ngakchang Rinpoche, and so he wrote a recommendation letter. And so I just traveled there, went there, and heard all the wild stories, but somehow he was extremely kind to me, like what he displayed with Rinpoche. He never did that to me. He was kind.
What kind of wild stories, Bar-ché Dorje? Because I've heard some wild stories too, but I don't know if people listening will necessarily know his reputation in that regard.
Well, he's called the Flying Lama. Students told me you can just stop the engine of a bus, all kind of threats, and then he seemed to be quite wrathful. He could be very direct by way of cutting through your distorted perceptions in a way. Like with Ngakchang Rinpoche, he could be quite, when Ngakchang Rinpoche came in, then the first thing he said, like, who's this idiot? So he could be quite direct with people. I've seen him direct with other people, for example, that then didn't take the opportunity because they somehow didn't know the Tibetan culture, what was quite a shame.
What did you see in that? Is there a story or anecdote you can remember there?
Yeah, for example, there was one Ngakpa going around in Boda, full ordination, and he was looking for Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, and I felt, because normally I didn't bring people there, because it was quite private, I decided I could bring him. So I brought him there, and so he kind of ignored him for a while, and then he looked and he said, "What do you want?" And then he said, "Well, Rinpoche, I hear you're famous about your Chalung practices, so I would like to request that from you." And then he said, "How dare you come in a whole Dzogchen, which is a different vehicle, outfit, asking me for practices of lower vehicles?" He says, "I'm just a drunk." He says, "Get out with your request, or just sit here with a drunken yoga and get drunk with me." Then he was kind of insulted and left. And I was sure if you would have sat there and had a whiskey with him, or this arak, which is a local drink they drink there, he would get teachings, but he didn't. And so sometimes he does those things, it's and some people also expect something from that reputation. Like another very high Lama comes in, and he has monasteries and just opened a new nunnery. And then he comes in, and the tea, everything all very holy. And then he said, "Oh, Rinpoche, I would really like you to bless my nunnery." And then he said, laughing, he said, "Would not be good for your reputation if I put all my tiglets in your nuns after 9 months." Like he had those kind of, and that culture, that's quite wrathful. And then he was still sitting there, and they said, "Oh, Rinpoche, now I have to go because I have teachings this afternoon." And then he said, "You decide to come here, I decide when you leave." So he just decided that. He was like a monarch of his place. And so he had those things, it's... And sometimes he just said to people, he asked him something, and then they were not willing, whatever, and then he just said, "Get out." Then they just had to go. So he had that side of him too. And he had a certain radiation that somehow it was not possible not then to question that. So he has tested me too, and I've one time he wanted to check my martial art. So he had a little field in front of his house. So his chair was brought down and he sat. And then one of his students had to come with a kukri knife, the knife that the Gurkhas use. Mm-hmm. And then he had to attack me and I had to defend myself. And he found that very funny. Well, suddenly 3 o'clock in the night, he starts shouting, Bar-ché Dorje, come out here, come here. And then you kind of have to come, because I was sleeping in the room next to him. And then I went out, and then he was doing the Gesar dances, singing and dancing, and then you had to kind of follow him, doing exactly what he did. But he just decided to do it at 3 o'clock in the night, and somehow he just then do it. So the other interesting thing is, for example, there was an American gentleman with me in '99, and he was from Berkeley University, and then he said to him, I said, you have to write a letter to Bush. And he said, yeah, well, it's kind of, and I don't know the exact words how that went, but then he said, Bush is a very good man. He said, very powerful. I said, you need to write him a letter that he has to bomb China. And then the guy said, well, Rinpoche, there's many good people in China too. He said, good people, good rebirth. Bad people, gone. They have a worse rebirth, and so we're not going to see him for a while. So he shocked people in that way. But then the interesting thing is, 2 years later, there was another American gentleman, and there was something going on in Tibetan, some discussion with other Tibetans. So we're just sitting in the back, and I started talking to this American gentleman about the style, and I was telling him this story. And then he suddenly stopped, and he looked at me, and then he said, that story was functional for that gentleman, but not for this gentleman. China actually had many good people. So he was totally unpredictable like that. So he could always read my mind. He knew exactly where I was. If I went to a place like in Chimichangchup, I fell a little bit in love there, then he knew. Or I went up to Nagi Gompa, and then he said, a little bit careful with all those nuns, because they like you and it's not good for their vows. And he just knew where I has been and things, and so he had a sense of that. So I also started to appreciate that. I just knew that wherever I've been, he had a sense of that.
How do you think he could tell all that sort of stuff?
I don't know. I never asked him. He just knew somehow. And then, well, what are you going to say? How do you know? If I would say that, he would just start laughing. But somehow he tapped into that. I don't think only Tibetan people can do it. I think there's more people in the world that do that, that have a sense. So it's, but he was one of them anyway. But then I could also be totally naked with him, like no pretense, and somehow we really liked each other, and we both liked our whiskies. So I was also his mate. He says, when Bar-ché Dorje comes, there's always party. But it was very interesting.
You also would have spent time with Jomo Sampel Dechen Rinpoche, Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche's wife. Now, what can you say about her?
With her, it takes a bit longer to get a relationship, because also because of culture. She's always somehow there, serving the tea, laughing about his jokes, but less involved. Like, she does less formal teaching, especially in the beginning. Now she does it more. But the interesting thing was that over time, that relationship also grew, because I would just happen to just pop in. I never made an appointment when I came into Nepal, and then I popped in, and it was very interesting, because normally when there's something official, he sits on his bed and she's serving tea, and she has arthritis in her hip, so she walks very difficultly, and he would not stick out a hand. And And I think some people might even find that disturbing as a sexist thing. But then one of his students said that this is actually quite important, because if he would not do that in his own culture, people lose inspiration. Then, of course, when I started popping in, I saw a whole other side, because then I just popped in, and he was just sitting in his underskirt on the floor, peeling potatoes for Jomo Sampo, who was throwing them in the water. And so when they were private, they were very much working together. It's just when he was in an official demeanor, then that's what he did. And I also found out that depending who was there, his demeanor changed. So, for example, for me, he did a Gesar dance, and then he was exhausted, and he collapsed on the floor. And then his students were rushing to pick him up. And he says, laughing, no. He says, no need, there's only Dzogchen here, in which it's a vehicle where you recognize that everyone has an enlightened nature. So there's actually less hierarchy. The only hierarchy to sit higher than someone else is because people can see you, like a stage. But in other vehicles, especially cultural, the Lama sits kind of higher, and the less Lama sits a little lower, and there's a whole hierarchy which works in that vehicle in that way to symbolically invoke a devotional aspect. And the devotion is there because then the student becomes more receptive, they become empty of their own ideas. So that's the principle and function of devotion. Because if you're full of yourself, then nothing can come in. So there's a principle of function there too. And in different vehicles that expresses itself differently. So that's why different people are also interested and drawn to different vehicles.
Did you learn Salung from Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, or was it primarily the Gesar dances?
Well, the dance he only showed a few times. What I learned from him was mainly telling stories. He gave me a transmission once of Dujum Lingpa. That's what he did. And then he gave a few transmissions which were connected with his personal Gesar Terma, which I still don't know what that means. I will tell that story a bit later. But he was mainly teaching and telling stories. Tsalung is from a different vehicle. We have Tsalung in our own gTer also, different kinds. But I never requested it because I didn't have that interest in that way. For me, it was more to be there. It's kind of time changes. I could start in the morning at 9 o'clock. We could down whiskey bottle, like duty free, like a liter in 2 hours. And I was not drunk. I was totally clear. You just had that effect. It was, I can't still not explain it. And it was full, vibrant energy. And, it's, because what he does, he has a shot glass, a little bigger shot glass. And the first needs to kind of overflow. And the first 3 glasses you need to down. And then you start normal drinking. That's what he did with me. I don't know why he chose the whiskey with me. But I became totally clear, totally not drunk. And as soon as I was not in his, then of course I would get drunk from drinks and things. But with him, it was never there. And then all kind of stories and teachings came out. And they were somehow always more connected with Dzogchen principle function. Or when I was planning to visit another Lama, then you had a whole story. For example, one time I wanted to visit Ngakchang Rinpoche, who is a big Gesar Terma, so I had an interest. And then he tells a whole story how he met, and the Ngakchang Rinpoche was actually really afraid, and he was the brother of Ling Gesar, and Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche, called Shampa, was a general of the opposite army. And so, but he had respect for Ling Gesar, so he was kind of hiding from the army, but the brother was very eager to catch him. So after a while he did, and then Kunzang Rinpoche killed him with a spear. And then he was thrown into prison, in that land to have a death sentence. But then 3 Dakinis came to Ling Gesar saying, if you don't let this general alive, you will not succeed in your quest. So, and then he became an important general in the army of Ling Gesar. And so then that whole information about his past life, certain things, then come up. And so there was always a circumstance what then had an effect. And so actually I learned a lot about culture, vehicles, different tertons, and how things weaved into each other. So you could understand the culture also much better. And you also always said, like, you don't need anything formal from me because you have your own teacher that is totally accomplished. But then somehow just being with him always had its own effect, which I can't really describe. You know, it's it's like transmission is all the time happening. Like he brings you on a different vibrational plane. Your radiation changes when you have been with him. Once we went with when Ngakchang was also there, for example, we just went out and the restaurant was too small, so we actually went into a dump where we were like killing animals, and there was loads of flies, and a few stinking toilets were there, and all the flies was really bugging him, but there was not one fly that landed on him and Jomo Sampo. Somehow they didn't. So that there was something about that being that somehow had an effect. Not only human beings, but all kind of beings. And somehow you could feel that. And so I just wanted to go back. And I never had a desire to ask for formal teachings. I was more like allowing things to unfold as they unfold. And there were always something would come out of it.
You know, what else should you say, or should I ask? You know better than me what you've seen and who you've met and what you've experienced. Is there something interesting or amusing or important that I should ask you about?
Well, the East is very interesting, and you meet a lot of Western Buddhists also that come from a different place. Some people somehow destroy their own possibilities in there. Yes, I had the lineage invocation from Ngakchang Rinpoche and Kandadachin. It was printed out in Tibetan. And so we wanted to give that to a few Tibetan Lamas and friends who are connected with us. And so I was going up to the mountains, the hills around Kathmandu Valley. And there's a Gompa, Nagi Gompa, that used to belong of Ergin Tuku. And now Chokyul and Chokinima is there often. He has like Shadras in Kathmandu Valley, and then they have a week retreat up there, and he has a nunnery there. So I was walking up there to also give him one of the lineage invocations, and so I went up there and it was getting a little late, but there was a big ritual going on. So I want to be a little polite, so I was kind of waiting, and I was sitting on the stairs, how you go up to the entrance. And then some Western individual came up to me, and he said, "You should never sit with the back to your Lama." And so I looked at the person, and I said, "Well, he's not my Lama." I said, "My Lama lives there in Bodha." And so I said, "This whole place is full of lamas, so where can I stand or sit?" And that person was very angry. And so he went back, and sat on his place. And but the sun was getting down, and it takes 2 hours to go walk down. And when it's dark, there's no light. So I just decided to go in. So I went in, did my 3 prostrations. I went straight while all this chanting and bells and all that stuff is happening. I went straight to the head teacher, and I said, sorry, Rinpoche, but I have something to show you. So he stopped his whole ritual. The rest continued, and he was reading. And then he looked at me and he said, "Oh, this is nice." He always does that. He likes my beard. And then he showed it to his older brother, and he was reading it. And I went back, because I want to go out. And then in the eye of my corner, he talked to a monk, and the monk started running to the sideways to meet me at the entrance. It was exactly where this person was sitting. And then this monk said to me, "Rinpoche is very impressed with the text you gave him, and he wants to invite you to his private residence." And I could see or feel the anger swelling up in this person. The sad thing is, whatever transmission was going on, because of his anger, he can't receive that transmission. Because on a vibrational, they're not a match. Because he's in his head with his anger, so whatever being transmitted or broadcasted there, he can't receive. And so I've seen more Western people do that. They get into a purest view of how things should be, and can be actually quite nasty also to new people. And I think that's quite a shame. There's no need for that. Most people are not coming to integrate in a culture. They come for some practice, and they come for self-development in whatever way they see fit or resonates with them. And then somehow there's no need. I'm kind of used to that behavior, but then somehow you might really put people off. So I think that's quite important to put out there, that people can just relax. People just sometimes just don't know, and there's no problem with not knowing. It's we expect certain things in England from people. Like here in Finland, everybody puts the shoes off. In England, this is not the case. Also in Holland, it's not the case. So if a visitor from Holland comes here and doesn't put his shoes off straight away, I'm not going to be angry. Because he doesn't know the culture. And I think with the Lamas it's the same. They're supposed to be enlightened beings, so they should not get angry when people don't understand the culture. But somehow sometimes there's a group around people, and they want to claim it, and they have some inner circle, and I think that's a shame. I'm really happy that we don't have that in our Sangha, and sometimes I like to communicate with that, also on the internet. Sometimes there's some trolls and things. I actually enjoy communicating with them in a way, if I can just plant a seed or let them think slightly different in a nice way, then I think that's useful.
And after what must have been about 10 years of being a student or so, in now, what was it, 2002, was it that you became a Lama? No,
well, there's no real thing. I was ordained in 2000. The reason was because I didn't have an esoteric reason. My main reason is I wanted to wear the color, like some people wear the color of the football team, and I wanted to live Rinpoche's promise. Because he promised to have the White Sangha be more known in the West. And so that's why I wanted to live that promise. So that's why I decided to be ordained. And then maybe 2002, 2003, I'm not sure. The thing is, what happened is when I was in Nepal, and he was still in youngness, it must be 2002 or 2003, he came to me and said, "Tomorrow you come back, but you don't bring a translator." I said, "Okay, Rinpoche." I said, "Will we bring something else?" He said, No, don't bring a translator." And what he did, he spoke for me in like an hour and a half. And what I felt is coming into a bubble with him, like the whole surrounding somehow disappeared. Like he was together in some light bubble or something. I can't explain it differently. But anyway, I didn't know what he was doing. I had no idea, but that was happening. And then he moved to Bodha. And then a few years later, he did the same in Bodha. So he said, "Tomorrow you come and no translator." And I already had a sense that something similar was going to happen, because it happened before, of course. And but then I had to go around the big curtain that most people call the stupa, but curtain is the Tibetan name. And I met a friend from Amdo who used to be my cook when I was in a solitary retreat in Nepal. And so we became friends. So he said, Bar-ché Dorje, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Kunzang. He said, I'm going with you. I said, well, I cannot forbid him to come. And so if Kunzang doesn't want him, he will ask him to leave again. But he didn't. And so they talked about Amdo for an hour at least, about all the holy places in Amdo, and he had a lot of fun, laughter, and then he said, okay, now you go sit on that place, and then he started the whole thing again. I felt the same, like you're in a different space. So I had no idea what was happening. After that, he gave us lunch, and then he said, now I'm tired of all this, I'm going to sleep, and you can go. So we went down, and I said to my friend from Amdo, I said, what did Kunzang say? I said, I don't know. I said, this is like a Kam dialect then or something, because he said, no, I'm from Amdo, we understand each other. He says, this is no Tibetan. He said, maybe Urgian language. But I don't know. Then, of course, a year later, Ngakchang Rinpoche came, and then he said that he gave me his personal Gesar Termas that he couldn't teach in this time, in his culture. So his students never received that from him. And well, he had a few years to live still, I guess. And so he decided to give that to me in essence, which I still don't know what that means. But then he talked to Ngakchang Rinpoche, and then he said his private termas should be expressed through the term of Rangvik Togden. That's the father of our Lingma, who is the Tet of the Arater. Rinpoche never talked about that term until Rinpoche decided to do that. So then somehow Ngakchang Rinpoche didn't have much choice, because you can't hold a terma and not be a full Lama. And so I went on a retreat. He called me with him, and he said, well, this is the case. I'm gonna give you the term of Rangvik Togden, so that Kunzang Rinpoche's termas can be expressed through that terma. And then he said, I ask you for one thing. He said, just don't get crazy. Still working on that. But then a year later, and actually, no, in the middle already, I found this old shawl that I really liked. So I brought it to him. And then he was wearing it all the time. And then he said, like, yeah, he said, this is a very good shawl. He said, you should wear this. And I said, well, in our lineage, you only wear this shawl when you're a teacher or a Lama. And I said, yeah. I said, maybe it's time, he says, you do that. So he also gave that indication by saying that I had to wear that shawl. And so I'm a full Lama. Although I don't feel that I have all the capacities of a full Lama yet. So I'm still in training. So they must see something that I don't see. But of course, it's a big inspiration to keep on practicing, because when you're responsible for students, somehow, you need to keep on practicing, because if they grow further than you, then somehow you have no answers anymore. And so it is a big inspiration, and I don't know what the plan further is, but that's the title anyway, by his authorization, by giving that in essence. So I have no idea how that will come out, or how that's going to be expressed. I don't know yet. But maybe with practice it will come out one day. It's a feeling I have, but nothing substantial. And then he did another thing connected with teachings, is then he said after lunch, he says, Bar-ché Dorje, you have time? I said, for you, all the time in the world. It's and I said, you have to stay, and you're going to make a torma. I said, Rinpoche, I don't know how to make a Torma. I said, I've never been taught because we don't practice this in our lineage, except 3 small ones when you get ordained. And he said, yeah, my students will help you. And it was a lot of fun, from this Tsampa and Butter, they make all those statues. And so they were making a black kind of guy with fire coming out of his mouth, some kind of a Chinese-looking hat, quite a wrathful face, and then all kinds of sticks and offerings around. Like for example, I had to do the meat, for example, what was red, and then the other student was painting the vegetarian offerings, and so I was thinking, nice red, and he came and said, not too much red. I said, Rinpoche, but this is meat. He said, yeah, but meat needs a lot of fat, so also some white pieces there. And so he was kind of joking around, but what I had to do, I had this big thing with a lot of incense sticks and things. Then I had to walk through Kathmandu to a dump. And so I had to place it in the dump, turn around, and don't look back. So then I asked the student what it was, and then he said, this is Mika. I said, well, what does that mean? And then he explained, Mika is gossip. So people that have bad attitude or trolls or whatever that come towards me, this Torma will take that over for me, so will not reach me in the same way. So, and that was then part of becoming a teacher.
Why is that part of becoming a teacher? Because the additional scrutiny or pressure you're under as a teacher? Is that the idea?
I don't know what he saw, but he just decided to do that to help me in the job, I guess. Or if you can call it a job.
When you say you feel that you don't have the full capacities of a Lama or as a Lama that you'd like to be or something like this, what do you mean by that? What is it that you feel that you're lacking in that regard?
I'm not in the enlightened state all the time, or in the non-dual state. So I'm still practicing. So that's what it means for me. But I guess things are quite aligned. But yeah, I mean, there's still coping strategies. Sometimes, it's not all is equally treated. There's preferences. Sometimes there's hope and fear. I mean, it's still there. More subtle, probably. But I mean, there's still a lot of work to be done. So
yeah, I suppose one of the I mean, I'm being a bit silly here, but one of the downsides of spending time with the sorts of caliber of people you spent time with is that that's a lot to measure up to.
Yeah, sure. I will do my best, and that's all I can do, and I just keep on doing the thing. I don't have lack of confidence, so it's not that. Because the funny thing is, and that sounds extremely strange, I have that with Kunzang Rinpoche, but I feel that all the lineage collectives and things, I feel almost like a channel almost when I teach. Sometimes information just comes to me. I have no idea where it comes from, and I know it's the right information. I don't know why I know that. So I feel that happening when I teach, sometimes Kunzang Rinpoche or even Ngakchang Rinpoche, they sometimes jump in. Sometimes, and my memory is really bad. Sometimes Ngakchang Rinpoche has said something 20 years ago, and then suddenly that comes out within my own personality. Sometimes I recognize, sometimes I don't. So I've learned to trust that. Because in the beginning I sometimes checked with Rinpoche, but I just learned to check. So I'm tapping into the lineage or the teachers from the lineages they represented, and I really feel that somehow. It's when I start teaching, it's almost like a runner's high. I get in this mode, and things just come. Like I never prepare anything when I start teaching. It just comes out. And so it's very interesting. And I've learned to start trusting that. So, and as long as I feel that support, I feel confident. And then, of course, I have a lot of my own work still to do. But, it's inspirational. So I'm happy to do that. It's for me, it's an ongoing investigation, how mind works, how I react in different circumstances. And somehow I think everyone has that. First, everyone comes in, wants results, wants enlightenment or whatever they want from it. But then there's a shift. And then somehow being part of a bigger picture becomes more important. You know, whatever you are, you're a cooperative component within that dimension. And I really feel that I am. I'm a cooperative component in that dimension of expansion so that more people can make a contact with the dimension of lineage, whoever is in there or connected with it. And so that's how I feel I am. And that's why I feel confident teachings, because I feel I am a cooperative component. And I will express it through my personality, which will have its point of attraction. But then every other Brevet Lama will do. So although I'm a Lama, I'm still in the Brevet Lama program. And so we actually quite really close and discuss things also together. So there's a whole group of beings. And a very nice, unique thing of Ngakchang Rinpoche and Candidation is they allow you to express things with your own personalities. Yeah. Like we don't have to become Rinpoche and Candidation's mini-me's or whatever. We don't have to copy anything. We can totally be our own person, express whatever we experience within practice and the teachings through our personality. And that makes it multifaceted. So we all have our own point of attraction. I mean, with me, you need to like my sense of humor when I teach. It's not easy.
Well, that's the downside of being Dutch.
I guess.
It's an acquired taste, the Dutch sense of humor.
That's true. That's the thing I miss sometimes. The humor in Holland grows sometimes.
Well, that's great. So how could people, if people are interested by this conversation, how could people find you or get in contact with you?
Facebook is the easiest.
Okay.
Yeah, just start communicating. I communicate with anyone on Facebook. So I'm also a masseur. So I always have little time in between. So quickly going to Facebook and things. I'm pretty active there. And then the website, Our Buddhism, I'm there too, with email address and phone, so people can find me there too.
Great. Well, I'll put a link to your Facebook profile in that case in the show notes. So if anyone's interested, they can scroll down and find the link. Well, Bar-ché Dorje, this has been really fascinating and fun conversation. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. It was fun for me too.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.